Dr. Jill Carnahan, welcome to Mold Week on Women's Wellness Radio.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you. You were just telling me you are gearing up to write a book on mold, so you are really interested in this topic. You have experience in this topic. It's perfect. Maybe just tell us more about your background as a medical doctor and how you got into all this.
You bet. So I always knew I wanted to do wellness and try to find root cause of disease for patients and actually help them heal. And I actually applied to naturopathic school and acupuncture school and traditional Chinese medicine and then ended up applying to allopathic MD school. And I really found that for me was the best way to really infiltrate the system, get to know the system that's, the most prevalent in the U.S. and really use that system in a way that helps and benefits patients. So I ended up going to allopathic MD school at Loyola and learned a lot, and it was a great foundation. I'm all about science, so I really, really love to approach even nutrition and wellness with the best science that's available. And a lot of times our practice is 20 to 30 years behind the research. So what I love to do is be on the cutting edge and try to implement things that are very safe, possibly beneficial, years ahead of the standard. And that excites me so that we can actually make change in real time as we're seeing the research come out. So in my journey, though, in my third year medical student, a lot of people have heard my story. I got breast cancer suddenly and was diagnosed with a very aggressive disease. So I took a year off of medical school, did 3-drug chemotherapy, radiation, multiple surgeries, and got through that. And next year I was considered in remission, went back to medical school. And about a year after that, I got diagnosed with Crohn's disease. So this was all at my age 25 and 26. So very, very young, facing life-threatening illness. And that really, really changed me and allowed me to see myself as a patient and how that experience was. And so then when I really started practicing medicine, I had such a better compassion and understanding for the patient because I'd been there and went into it with just a drive and a passion to help people heal and was doing great, even after cancer and Crohn's, and completely healed from Crohn's disease as well, and started to practice in Boulder in 2010. And my partner, Dr. Browntree, and I just had a great, thriving practice and really enjoyed that. And then about 2014, the year after the massive floods in Boulder, very similar to what we're seeing with the hurricanes in Houston and in Florida, there was a lot of water and water damage, including my office building. And about a year later, I started having symptoms of mold toxicity. And I didn't know it at the time. But in hindsight, I found the Stachybotrys in the basement, 2 floors directly below my office. And I was having symptoms of shortness of breath, frequent infections. My immune system had completely crashed. And skin issues, rashes, red and itchy eyes, shortness of breath, brain fog, trouble word finding. So all of these things kind of came to a head when I found out there was mold. And I literally left my office, left everything in it, and started over and started that healing process. And so for me, I'm so passionate about this topic because I've been through this as well. And I'm on the other side now. I'm completely healed and actually I frequently travel to hotels sometimes that are moldy. And I do quite well because I've learned how to take care of myself and how to heal from that toxic insult. And so I would love to share with your listeners some of the things that I've learned on the journey.
That's awesome. Yeah, I knew you were exposed to mold, but I haven't interviewed you about mold before. I think I interviewed you about MTHFR before, and we just sort of slightly talked about mold. So I didn't realize the extent of your story. And I'm glad you're bringing up these floods in Boulder 2014. Is that when they happened?
Yeah, 2013. And then just about a year later is when things really get bad. So for all the hurricane victims right now, it may not be severe, but next year, if people aren't careful, this could be a really big issue in these areas that have been flooded.
Right. Yeah. We're trying to get this close as possible to these hurricanes because I think if you can remediate really well and know what to look for. I don't know in your case, in your office, was there like a leak you didn't know about or you didn't quite know how to remediate? What happened for you?
Yeah, so of course, when you're dealing with a landlord, which this situation was, you don't really have control. It has to be the landlord that helps. I mean, you don't have the ability to completely clean up or do what you need to do. And so because of that, we asked the landlord to take some action and he really wasn't interested. And so our other option was just to leave.
Okay, so that's what you and your partner did. Yeah, and we should say you're getting an IV therapy right now as we record this, which is really, really fun. Is that more related to your cancer history, or is this kind of something you still do kind of because of the mold exposure, or?
So this is interesting, Bridget, because I don't always talk a lot about this, and I'm happy to share, but I actually developed a immune deficiency. And I think it's a combination of the cancer and the chemotherapy. And then the mold exposure really took me over the edge because that's when I was diagnosed. And we know one of the profound things that mold does is weaken the immune system. So there's a combination of massive toxic exposure, and it causes immune deficiency in some cases, and other old infections like viruses, or say someone had a tick bite when they were a child and they have Lyme. Those kinds of things can pop up after a mold exposure because the immune system is in a weakened state. And so I've definitely battled the immune dysfunction. I have this belief that it's not going to be permanent, that someday I can overcome it. But for now, I'm getting immune globulin infusions that help me fight infections and do my day-to-day thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I was just curious because I'm still on the process as well. I just got my first ozone therapy yesterday, actually. And, I've interviewed people who said it's 6 months or whatever, but I'm like, I think it's a pretty long road. And like you said, I think it was helpful for me to hear that can kind of, your immune system becomes so dysregulated that other things that your body is dealing with that maybe it's been able to control before. Like I had Epstein-Barr virus kind of reappear, and Hashimoto's. Yeah. We probably have a lot in common. Go ahead.
I have two analogies I'd love to talk about that will help people understand. The first one is the total toxic load. So this concept of total toxic load is really key to understanding because we're all born with a bucket. And that bucket is our ability to handle toxic exposures. And we all have them. I mean, through a lifetime, we accumulate toxic exposures. I grew up in a farm and there was lots of pesticides and chemical exposures. And I have no doubt that in combination with my poor detox genetics, that was one of the factors that led to my cancer at 25 years old. And then that toxic burden. So if that bucket starts to fill up and it's over the top and starts to spill out, that's when we have disease. And often it'll be autoimmune disease, like you mentioned, Hashimoto's. It could be lupus or MS, something more serious. And it could also be things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, and also cancer. So all of these things, cancer, neurodegeneration, dementia, and autoimmunity can all come from that total toxic load reaching the top and spilling over. And it's a conglomeration of toxins like mold and old infections like Epstein-Barr that you and I have both dealt with. And those things all in combination make that load. So my job as a functional medicine doctor is to look at that load and start to decrease the level in the bucket, because you don't need to treat every single thing in the body, toxin and infection. All you have to do is lower the level so the person has margin again so they can function and fight the infections themselves or get rid of the toxins themselves through detox. And that could be, IV therapies or ozone therapies or infrared sauna or Epsom salt baths or glutathione. There's so many ways to detoxify. And because our world is so toxic, many of our patients are living at the level where their bucket is completely full. But it's a combination. If you have perfect, wonderful health and you get in a moldy building, it probably won't take you down. It's a combination of stress and lifestyle and old infections and other toxins that take up that load. And the mold might be the thing that takes you over the top. But usually by itself, it's not. It's a combination of things. And that's real important to understand.
Yeah. And we have Mira Desi, who was just in some of the floods in Houston, talking about some of the stress piece, because it's very stressful to go through these incidents, and just life can be really stressful before you got exposed to mold. So I think that's an important piece to talk about. I want to dig into the mold itself later, but I'm just curious about your approach. You're saying just to lower the overall load. So I'm just curious, do you kind of
do that?
Which one do you do first or all at once, or does it depend on the client?
Yeah, it depends. So I cast a very wide net and do a lot of testing. I'm looking at metabolic function. I'm looking at genetics. Last time we talked about MTHFR and other genes that affect detoxification. I'm looking at nutritional status. So how is their reserve? How is their ability to detoxify? And then all kinds of infections, from atypical bacteria like Mycoplasma and Chlamydia pneumonia, things like Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichia, and then many viruses, Epstein-Barr, CMV, HHV6, HSV1 and 2, varicella, West Nile virus. There's so many viruses, and viruses can be a huge burden on the system as well. And viruses, notoriously, once you have them, they stay in your system and they remain dormant. But if you get weakened immune system due to a mold exposure, often those things will pop up and reemerge and cause problems. So I cast a really wide net and kind of take a look at the landscape and say, what pieces of the puzzle are here? what genetic risk factors, what detoxification risk factors, what toxic load, heavy mercury or lead or other chemicals and pesticides, and then what infection. And then what I do is one by one, shoot at each one of them. And typically I'll try detoxification first, because if you try to treat an infection and the patient is very, very toxic, they won't do very well. So very simple things, like I said, infrared sauna, glutathione, binders, Epsom salt baths, alkaline water or mineral water. There's some really wonderful, simple things that people can do every day. And of course, one of my main things is clean air, clean water, clean food. Super, super simple. They need air filters in their home and work, clean water, water purifiers, and systems to keep clean water or make sure you're drinking filtered water, and then clean food. Those foundational things, as simple and as boring they're not glamorous, are huge for decreasing that load in the bucket.
Yeah, it's funny. I talked about some of these same things on my talk. I talked about the things that helped me the most were sauna, coffee enema, which is kind of a glutathione producer. And I talked about the binders with the sauna, and then nasal rinse, which is kind of going with the infections category. And yeah, it is kind of boring, so to speak, but I feel like it's a waste of money to chase after all these other things that can make you sicker unless you have these basic things going. I want to ask you a bit about the air filters, because I think we talked about that on our last interview, and I want to share my experience and get your feedback. So we frankly made some mistakes. Like, we still were living in our house while we tried to remediate it, but we bought a very fancy Austin air filter, very expensive, and it didn't do anything for us. And then we were afraid it was covered in toxins, and we just sold it because we didn't want to have it anymore. And similar in our second house, we had we rented a house that ironically had one just kind of separate room that had some mold, and we did like an ozone air filter and a plasma, and that didn't do anything for us either. So I'm just curious, is my experience unique, or what do you think I did wrong with that?
So that's a really good question, because obviously there's different situations. One of the things I'm such a big proponent of is obviously a good HEPA filter as a foundation. That's particulate matter. And you can have MERV ratings in your air filters, even in your home. And the higher the MERV, MERV rating, the more particulate it will actually weed out. So if you have high allergies or mold sensitivity, you'd want like a MERV 11 or a MERV 13, the highest level that your place or house can actually do. I know in my office, I think we have MERV 11 because the thicker MERV 13 won't fit in the slot. So that's as high as we can go. And that's a filter that's usually in your HVAC system. And the other thing is the HEPA filter, you can actually get systems in houses that actually have HEPA filters built in. I think a freestanding HEPA filter is not a bad idea for individual rooms. And then I'm a huge fan of the VOC filter. So volatile organic solvents are things like smoke and fumes and formaldehyde. And a lot of the toxins from mold are VOCs. So they're not visible, they're not particulate, they're so small they can penetrate skin and lungs. And it's very important to find a filtration system that actually helps to decrease the VOCs. And that's the hard part. Now, I do like Austin Air. I use them at home and work, and I've had good success. But I know that some people with any filter can have some issues or don't feel a lot better. For me, the Austin Air with the VOC filter in my home and work was life-changing. Another great brand is IQ Air, and that also has VOC filters. And I believe there's Air Oasis, which actually puts out a little bit of ozone. For patients who have very, very sensitive inflamed lungs, the Air Oasis can be an issue, but it actually has the ability to kind of remediate the air. So it's actually really powerful, but it's so powerful that it can create some oxidative stress in the patients who already have lung inflammation. So I'm also often careful about recommending that brand.
Oh, yeah. I've kind of heard that ozone can be a mixed bag.
Irritating, yeah.
Yeah. And, even as I say these things, like to put an air filter in a room that's still... So you probably put your filters in like a clean house, so to speak. It wasn't a house that was still...
I think that might have been the key, because if you have an issue, the air filter is not going to solve it.
Yeah.
So sometimes temporarily it might give you a tiny bit of relief, but I completely agree and see probably why you didn't have great success, because you need what I did is when I moved, I would, have the air filter, bought and delivered to the new office in the new space in my home that was new. And all of those spaces were, not contaminated. And then the air filter just took it to a new level.
Okay, so that's good advice. So if you're, yeah, it's so important, and that's why we're trying to do this quickly. It's so important to address the stuff, get this,
Yes.
get out of the place, or if you just got flooded, really, and we've talked about this in some other talks, really be discriminating on what you get rid of and what you repair, because you don't, like you said, a year later want to be stuck with symptoms and sickness. So get the filter in the purified space, so to speak, and it helps with some of the just the normal residual, stuff in it.
And new construction, a lot of people who've had mold exposure are sensitive because their bucket, when your bucket gets full, you are super sensitive to chemicals. So the typical multiple chemical sensitivity patient is actually because their toxic load is high. So sometimes just having a filter to take out the VOCs from your new flooring or your paint or whatever is happening, new construction is always going to have a lot of off-gassing, no matter how clean it is. So just a filter in a new home is a great idea, just to decrease those VOCs from the new materials.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So you mentioned the VOC, that will get the mold toxins. Is that correct?
So there's a bunch of different, we call it toxic soup because there's spores. Spores are actually the thing that probably won't cause, can cause some damage, but it's not the most toxic part of the mold. Those are the things that you pick up in air sampling and stuff. And then if you use bleach or something on a mold, you're going to destroy the membranes and actually disperse smaller particles that can be very inflammatory as well. So there's particulate matter, and it can be from bacteria, actinomyces, and mold. So it's more than just mold, but there's lots of different bacteria, inflammagens, we call them, because they're particles that stimulate the inflammation in the immune system. And then VOCs are invisible. They're fumes, and they're actually gases and fumes and odors and things from mold. And those can cause massive damage in the body as well. The musty smell that we talk about, that's one of the VOCs from mold. And anytime you smell a musty smell, there's going to be mold somewhere. That's like a guarantee of a mold issue if there's a musty smell.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks for clarifying that mold toxins versus mold spores a little more. And we talked about doing the basic things to support detox pathways. I'm sure people are curious, like the more in-depth things you do. You want to get into that?
Sure. So first thing is identifying the source, because if you start to treat a patient and they have a massive moldy home or environment that they are still going to be in every day, it's going to be really hard to get them well. You're like bailing water out of a boat that has a leak. It's just one of those things. Now, sometimes I do start binders when they're in the moldy environment, but it's just a lot more difficult. So the number one thing that is by far the hardest step is to get out of the situation or remediate. And some patients who are really, really sick, remediation can be an issue too, because they're kind of stirring the things up and they may get re-exposed. So usually I have them leave the home if possible during the remediation. And there are some patients that are so sick and so inflamed that remediation doesn't cure the problem because of leftover dust and particulate that's still stimulating their immune system. So getting out of the situation, whether it's home or work, is number one. And there's just no getting around that. It's difficult, it's expensive, but there's no getting around that piece. So for example, for your hurricane victims, if you're going back to a home that's been damaged and you walk in and there's growth on the home, please get a professional or wear protective gear. You can get a suit to wear, an N95 respirator mask. Even that won't be 100% protection, but you don't want to go in with a little painter's mask that will give you no protection. So very, very important to protect yourself.
What was the type of mask again?
It's called N95 respirator. So it actually has a charcoal filter in the mask. And even that's not perfect, but that's your best bet to at least have some protection from the VOCs and the particulate matter. Really, really important. Otherwise, if you can afford a professional, that's by far the best way to go, where you stay out of that. And any sort of porous material like clothing or rugs or paper goods that have been damaged by water, you have to get rid of. Now, clothing you can often clean. If it's just been in a moldy house and not been water damaged and saturated with water and moldy itself, then you can probably clean it. But paper is really difficult. So you can either store it away in plastic containers until you're well, or you can get rid of it like I did. When I left my medical office, I left a whole library of books that I'd collected over 20 years, and it was sad, but my health is pretty important, so I gave that up pretty freely. So number one, get out of the situation. Number two is binders and helping your liver and gallbladder detoxify. You mentioned Epsom salt, sauna, coffee enemas. Those can all be helpful things that enhance detoxification. I actually use prescription binders like cholestyramine and Welchol. And then we typically will add in clay or charcoal or other things.
What was the second one after cholestyramine?
Cholestyramine and Welchol.
Well call? Okay, I haven't heard of that one. Okay, and those are prescriptions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you use binders. So binders bind to the mold toxins and other toxins as well?
So binders basically will help to pull so how the detox works is your liver phase one takes the toxic substance and throws it into the intermediate state, and then phase two will detoxify that and push it out into the bile in the gallbladder. The gallbladder then excretes the bile into the gut where your body eliminates that toxin. When we use binders basically will grab the bile acids and pull those out and escort them out with the toxic load. So you basically decrease your toxic burden through the bile acid binders. Cholestyramine and Welchol are real common bile acid binders. And then there's also, we use clay, charcoal, mentioned cholestyramine, clay, charcoal, and sometimes chlorella or glycomannans. And all of these things actually bind different toxins in the body, not just mold. Some of those bind endotoxins, some of them bind heavy metals. So you're basically decreasing toxic load by just little by little binding the toxins out of the body.
Okay, great. Yeah, and it seems like they're usually really well tolerated. Do you find that?
Usually, yeah. The main side effect is bloating, gas, or constipation. So sometimes the issue is if patients are actually already constipated, it's hard to give them binders.
Okay. Through liver gallbladder. Okay. And then after the binders, what's your step?
After the binders, typically we'll do all the detoxification stuff. So the sauna, the Epsom salts, all of those. And then we'll try to normalize infections and other markers. There's a ton of complex markers that we look at with the chronic inflammatory response to mold. And those are things like TGF-beta, C4A, and C4A, they are, what else? VEGF, MSH, and MMP9. And so we'll look at all of those different pieces of the immune system and try to normalize the ones that are abnormal.
Okay.
I would actually say, though, it's really important to understand the getting out of the situation, and then binders are really, really 80% of the solution. So the rest of it is just mopping up infections and treating abnormalities in the immune system, fixing the endocrine system. So a lot of that is supportive, but the real issue is getting them out of the situation and supporting detoxification.
That's really interesting. That's kind of encouraging too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was watching Dave Asprey's Moldy movie, and I think Mark Hyman on there said his steps were remove the situation, then remove the mold from your body, and then third, he said repair the systems that have been damaged, which I thought was interesting. It's kind of what you're talking about now with this last step, because the body's become dysregulated, right? And like you said, there could be other infections.
So you support immune system, and there's there's probably 1,000 things you could do in there, but it's kind of looking at the individual, if they have thyroid or adrenal dysfunction, hormone dysregulation, if they have immune dysfunction, if they have hidden or occult infections, if they have inflammation, or if they have gut issues, dysbiosis, SIBO. So you're treating like a full functional medicine approach, all the other things as well.
Okay, so at this point, we're doing a functional medicine approach to kind of all the root causes and all the root. I guess they're root causes, but I also kind of think of them as root. What's the word? I have poor still some more. It's like I feel like they're kind of just fallout from the mold as well.
Absolutely.
So but you have to deal with all those. So you mentioned earlier that you like to do a lot of cutting edge stuff, and people might be thinking, I go to my doctor and they're going to do some cutting edge stuff. But it's really not the case, right? You're probably in private practice where you get more freedom to practice how you want and run the labs you want and not deal with insurance. Can you just tell us more about that?
I do. I have a cash practice, and it's interesting. I do that, obviously, the freedom of not having to take the time to deal with the insurance companies. What I tell patients is I work for them 100%. I'm there in front of them. They have all my attention, all my time. I'm not working for a third party. And what gets, muddied the waters is when we have the insurance companies tell us when and what we can order, what we can do, what they'll cover. And that actually makes me pretty mad, because it's not always in the patient's best interest. It's about the bottom line. So what I love about my practice is I'm doing what's best for the patient. And of course, in conjunction, financially, we try to make it doable in any way, shape, or form. But I can do stuff that's not only cutting edge, but also the best thing for the patient, irregardless of the insurance. I do try to get labs and things covered. So whenever possible, we do work with them through medications and labs. And we do things like we mentioned, infrared sauna and massage therapy and other detoxification methods. And then I use lots of nutritional supplements to support their system. So if, say, adrenal support or binders or DHEA when they need adrenal issues, thyroid support, other things like glutathione or precursors for the liver like lipoic acid or N-acetylcysteine. And then IVs can be helpful too. Sometimes we'll do IV vitamins, IV glutathione, or anything like that to boost up the system. Really, whatever works that's safe, I'm open to. And usually I like to see some research on it.
Mm. Yeah, and so if people were to go to their doctor in their insurance system, I mean, what percentage of people do you think are aware of this mold issue, never mind, like, know how to treat it?
Gosh, I get emails every day from desperate people, and it's so sad to see the many people who have been sick for so long. And when they hear a new interview like this or something else, and they're like, "Oh my goodness, that's me." We had flooding in the basement, and ever since then I've been sick. So often the story will tell it if they've had an incident of flooding or something where they know there was a change or moved to a new home, and they were sick ever since then. That can be a mold issue. So typical things like flat roof buildings and leaks and water damage that's been there and neglected and not repaired can be an issue for them, and it can stimulate the immune system. And it can cause things like chronic pain syndrome, dementia. We have a type 3 Alzheimer's that I teach with Dr. Dale Bredesen's protocol, and it's all about an exposure to a biotoxin like mold that affects the brain and actually causes dementia. That's pretty scary.
Yeah, it's really scary, but I mean, like I said, I still have some poor recall that people I'm sure notice when I do interviews, but I'm hopeful that I can.
You will get better.
Yeah,
you will.
It's a matter of being proactive, right? So all the things we're talking about, it's a lot to take in. It's complicated. Your medical doctor, your primary care probably won't know what you're talking about at all if you come to mold. But you have to research. You have to find a website like yours or find an event like this, because if you're sick and you can't find a reason. But like you said, there's usually a story. There's usually something that people can say, oh, yeah, you know what? I did, ever since I lived in that one apartment, feel sick
And I will tell you, it's actually, so a couple of really key points for your listeners. Number one, if you suspect this and you can't get your doctor's help, you can do some things on your own. I've written a couple articles that give you lots of protocols. I actually have a 6-page free guide. If you've been exposed to mold, here's how you start. And it has literally name brand products, all kinds of things to get you started on your own. That's safe, and that's free. If you just search Dr. Jill Free Mold Guide on Google, it will be the first thing that comes up. So Dr. Jill Free Mold Guide is free. It's a thing I put together just for people who I can't see. So that's number one. Take control of your life and do what you can. Number two, labs. You can order yourself through lifeextension.com. There's a biotoxin mold panel that will tell you if you have inflammation in your body related to mold. That's something you can do. It will cost $300 or $400 that you can do direct without a doctor's order. And there's also the genetics, which are real important in this disease for mold. It's called HLA mold type, and it's called HLA genetics for mold. And it is also on Life Extension. So patients can actually order those labs themselves. They can start by getting rid of remediating the house or doing something about it themselves. So there's a lot of things patients can do by themselves to get started.
That's great. We're going to definitely link to that the mold guide. Sure. That's wonderful. Okay. And then we'll link to the Life Extension site as well. So you are in Boulder, Colorado. You see people locally. And are you still in a situation you kind of see people locally first once before you can move to online or phone?
I tried to establish care in the state, which is legally what I need to do. So I do like to see people in person the first visit, and then I do Skype and phone for follow-up. I do the best I can, and there's some people who can't travel, and I'll try to make exceptions on an as-needed basis for that.
Okay, so we'll link to that site as well, and when you write your book, we'll be happy to support that as well. Thank you. I think you and I are both really passionate about just getting this information out. Oh, last question I want to ask you, because I meant to, how common do you think mold toxicity is in affecting people's health?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because people are like, oh, that doesn't affect me. 25% of the houses and buildings in the U.S. are likely affected by mold. That's 1 in 4. And about 24% of the population is susceptible to this. So I see it as your eyes are opened, as yours and mine both are now. It is everywhere. I see so many patients where this is the underlying issue. I've had patients with multiple sclerosis, with Crohn's disease, with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth that present, aren't getting better, and the underlying issue is mold. So you'd be surprised at how many ways it pops up in disease and in patients' lives. And it's very common, sadly.
Okay, so 1 in 4 buildings are moldy, probably at least. I think sometimes I hear
Yes,
higher.
at least.
At least.
Yeah.
1 in 4 people are genetically susceptible to mold. And we didn't get that into a lot, but maybe we got into it a little bit throughout the course of this week, is that some people just can't tag the mold toxins to clear, and when you're sick, you're probably safe to assume you're one of them. But yeah, I think it's behind so many diseases, and with kids with asthma or ADD, and if you feel like you can't find the reason, keep looking, because I think I was the same. I told Dave Asprey I didn't watch his mold movie when it came out because I thought, oh, that's some obscure thing that only but it is actually more common than you think. And I just think such an important thing for everyone to be aware of, whether you're in the public or you're a practitioner, because maybe there's a friend you can help or a neighbor you can help. Just bring this awareness too.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Bridget, for doing this. This is so insightful and so profound. I will do everything I can to share what your message is, because this is huge, and I appreciate what you're doing to share the word and to get the word out to people who are hurting.
Oh, well, thank you. And you as well. Thank you for putting your big brain to work on this topic of mold. I think it's really great.
Thank you for bearing with me today with infusion and temperatures and things.
Oh, no, I think it was kind of fun. I think it's kind of fun.
You're here with me.
We're always doing things to support our health, even as practitioners.
Yep. It's practice what I preach, right?
Exactly. Well, thanks again, Dr. Jill, and we'll link to all the resources.
Okay.
I know there was a lot of detailed information, and if you have joined the week, you'll get all the notes. It's all free, but just so we can have an email to send you all the notes from this talk, as long as you've joined this week, which you can do at our website, or maybe you've already done if you found this, we'll send you all the notes so you can see, okay, that's the supplement, or that's the lab, or that's the whatever she talked about. So thanks again, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you, Bridget.